everyone, and welcome back. This past week I have been working on a project of making an elastic corset from around 1805. And in the process of making this corset, I've had a lot of questions from people wanting to know more about the concept of elastic, since, not surprisingly, elastic as we know it in modern day was not around in 1805. Instead, what this elastic corset relies on is the use of very tiny metal springs. And elasticated items throughout the centuries generally refer to anything that had the ability to grow and stretch and return back to its original size. This could be by way of metal springs. It could be done through knitted textiles that have what we consider a mechanical stretch to them, where they have the give and take. They can also be done on things like regular textiles, where you use the bias of a fabric in order to have more stretch on the diagonal. It can also mean things like leather that have stretch and give and bounce back. Elastic is a property as much as it is an actual thing. However, historically, the elastic that we are familiar with, the rubber-based or later synthetic elastics that we are used to, have a very interesting and specific history to them. So that is what I wanted to go through today, so that way we could actually get a better picture of the history of rubber-based elastics and other rubber-based items, how they were used throughout history, and how they have a major impact on our current fashions and lifestyle. Rubber in its natural state actually goes incredibly far back in history. There are archaeological records of it being cultivated and specifically used as far back as the 17th century BCE in Mesoamerica. This particular type of rubber is a sap that comes from trees. You might know it better as latex rubber. Latex rubber has an incredible number of uses in its tree sap format, and can also be smoked and cured to have different qualities to it and different purposes. All sorts of groups throughout Central America used latex rubber for so many different things. We know that it was being used as a waterproofing. It was a great way to keep your feet dry. You could actually dip your entire foot in latex, let it dry, and then you essentially had custom fit galoshes. It was also being used to protect against heat, since it is a great insulator. In fact, there are reasons why it's still used in electrical equipment as an insulator today. So this works very well in cookware. And it can also be a very quick and easy way to make molds of things like bowls or cups. One of its other major purposes within Mesoamerica was that of rubber balls. The game that was played throughout that region, stretching all the way up to where modern Arizona is today and all the way down to modern Paraguay, there were different versions of this particular ball game being played all over. And it was not just a sport. It was of massive cultural and community importance. It was used potentially in politics and government. It was even used as a way to possibly tell historical stories and act them out. There are just so many different ways that this potentially was used within the different societies as a major central point in their lives. So these rubber balls were incredibly important. And in fact, we know that at one point Montezuma was receiving about 16,000 of them per year as tribute. Obviously, they had massive importance and a lot of usefulness in many ways to the community. This, of course, where we reach Montezuma, is where it starts to make its way over to Europe. Hernando Cortés was the first European to come over and discover rubber at this time. That was in 1519, and he was deeply interested in it and its many uses. The problem came in the fact that it is a natural product that will rot, degrade, and become unfunctional with a brief amount of time and change in weather. So as they tried to take the latex and move it back over to Europe, it rotted, it fell apart, it didn't work. So it was sort of forgotten about by the Europeans for over 200 years. It wasn't until 1715 that Francois Fresnel actually wrote an entire paper on the potential uses of rubber, and he presented it to the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. At which point he had also discovered that the use of turpentine along with latex would allow it to travel and transfer. So suddenly that opens up a lot of possibilities for what this particular product could be used for. And in its early stages, it was still very difficult to work with. It was either very brittle or a liquid. It didn't last very long. It wasn't particularly pleasing color or texture or smell. There were a lot of problems that it had before it could be turned into a mass-produced useful item. The earliest renditions that we normally see it as are for things like heat transfer issues where you can coat the handles of cookware, or, as not surprisingly, erasers. And of course, from that is where we get the term rubber, because the earliest erasers were termed India rubbers because you just simply rubbed out your mistakes. As for some of the other European languages' terminologies for rubber, a lot of those centralize around the local word for the tree that the latex came from, caoutchouc, which translated into things like caoutchouc or caoutchouc, and thus we have two of the major sources for terminology for this particular good. As for the usefulness of rubber itself, the turpentine wasn't doing enough. The rubber was still very brittle and it fell apart fairly easily. Thus, there had to be a new system of processing it. And this is where Thomas Hancock comes in. And he came up with the process of shredding the rubber and then reforming it under pressure and with heat. This machine that he used eventually became known as the masticator, though during its developmental stages throughout those years, he referred to it as a pickler. I just find that amusing. What resulted from this, though, is that it was a much more durable and long-lasting rubber. At this point, we start seeing it being used in textiles and other fashionable items. One of the earliest uses for it was in Macintosh coats, where it would be sandwiched in between two layers of cotton in order to create a waterproof textile. Unfortunately, the result was something that smelled pretty terrible and was susceptible to body heat, meaning that as someone wore it for a long period of time, it might start to get a little bit tacky and sticky, so not the best circumstance. And that meant that something needed to advance forward in order for this to be a feasible item in fashion. At that point, Thomas Hancock's brother, John Hancock, not the John Hancock, but just a John Hancock, stepped forward and managed to figure out a new way to process the rubber, which meant that it got rid of most of the smell and it was not nearly as susceptible to body heat, and thus the Macintosh coat became an incredibly popular item in fashion. It's actually a brand that still exists today, though it has moved over to Japan, and it's still being popularly sold to this day. There were other formats of rubber around at this time as well. One of the ones that you may have heard me talk about before is Gutta Percha. Gutta Percha is a type of latex rubber, but it does come from a different tree than that latex rubber coming out of Mesoamerica. Gutta Percha, therefore, has a slightly different quality to it. It doesn't have the elastic nature that we're used to in the same way. It does very well to adhere things together, but it becomes hard and can be fairly brittle, meaning that it just isn't going to do what we're used to it doing in an elastic sense. However, what it was terribly useful for was adhering things together like the soles of shoes. So cementing shoes together by way of Gutta Percha became very popular starting in the 1830s and continued well into the 1850s. The main reason why we left off using that was actually because, one, the quality of Gutta Percha was a little unpredictable, and apparently, at least according to documents from around that era, they were starting to see that the quality coming in was pretty random and unpredictable. This wasn't necessarily because of its organic nature, but because of the industry and the process that they were going through. It just wasn't coming out like they were hoping it would, and it meant that you couldn't predict whether your product, the shoes, were actually going to be good or not. So they moved on to other formats of cementing in the years after that. The concept never really went away, and we still cement our shoes together today. Now, Gutta Percha definitely had other purposes that it was well designed for, and eventually in the 20th century, it was sort of replaced by Bakelite, which it's really similar in its overall look and appearance and feel. But Gutta Percha wasn't the only type of rubber that could achieve this in the 19th century. Going back to the rubber that we were talking about previously, just the standard regular latex rubber, Nathaniel Hayward specifically started working on a process of combining rubber with sulfur and high heat, and he considered that process sulfurization. It was a great idea, but it wasn't coming out quite right, so he reached out to Charles Goodyear, and they started working more on the process to figure out how to make it more consistent and predictable. Well, this is where Thomas Hancock comes back in again, and he managed to improve the process to the point where they could predict very clearly what sort of hardness, what sort of stretchiness they would be getting out of the final format of rubber. And this was what was patented in 1844 as the term vulcanization. But this is the point where rubber production really took off, and you start seeing it absolutely everywhere in the 1840s and 1850s. It is an absolute craze. This is when we start to see the elastic as we are used to it, where they have very thin, tiny strands of elastic that becomes wrapped in some sort of thread and then gets woven into a larger textile. So this is when we get things like Congress boots that come in with their elastic sides. They became immensely popular by 1847. Queen Victoria loved them, and everyone picked up on it after that. In 1848, Godey's Ladies magazine wrote that Congress boots had become such a popular thing that they were nearly impossible to find. They were always sold out. Interestingly enough, the actual process of weaving elastic into a textile is a bit complex. You can't just weave it back and forth like you normally would with threads because of its elastic and stretchy nature. In order to keep that consistent, where you wouldn't have one section of the textile be a little tighter than the other, what they actually do is stretch out the threads of elastic and cool them off so they stop being stretchy. And at that point, they weave the entire textile and then heat it back up. It shrinks back up to its standing position and will be able to stretch evenly from there. Of course, this means that the elastic is not being used on its own. You won't find textiles then or now that are entirely made out of rubber, whether it's synthetic or natural. You always have some sort of other fiber involved. When you think about it in the historical context, it makes a lot of sense because having that thread wrapping reduces abrasion, it reduces issues of body heat transfer that might cause the elastic to stretch more or less depending on the temperature. It just generally helps control a lot of the issues that people were having with the early formats of elastic, and it's continued to be just the easiest way to deal with it to this day in a textile format. One of the major problems that the fashion industry was having with rubber is the fact that it's a very unpleasant milky color. It's not very fashionable. Organic material could be added to the rubber, but it pretty much limited it to gray or black. The addition of organic dyestuffs was not feasible because vulcanization required such a high heat in order to process the rubber that it pretty much destroyed all organic matter that you would put into it for dye. This, of course, started to change pretty rapidly near the middle of the century. Only 2 years after Hancock's patent was put in for vulcanization, Alex Parks managed to find another way of processing rubber that meant that they could start to add color in. This utilized sulfur chloride instead of the high heat process, and it opened up a whole world of new colors which only grew as the invention of aniline dyes came along. Despite the range of colors that was possible, by far the most popular color for vulcanite rubber was black. Dark coal black. And you could find this in all sorts of very interesting objects. Think of it as no different than we use plastic today to mold into many different types of objects. They were using vulcanite rubber for many of the same things. One of my favorite examples of vulcanite rubber's opportunities comes in 1851. The Great Exhibition that took place in London in 1851 featured multiple exhibits on vulcanite rubber, the largest of which was by Charles Goodyear, and he had an entire large exhibit of nothing but vulcanite everything, and I do mean everything. It was basically an entire household, an entire day, what you go through in your life. Everything was vulcanite rubber. Yeah, everything. There was actually a review published in numerous newspapers that talked about the hundreds of different uses for vulcanite. It reads as a story of a man's daily life traveling across the country. His clothing, accessories, utensils, furniture, vehicles, weapons, camping gear, children's toys, and even his coffin are all made of this miraculous material. Even the bed sheets, which just sounds like a terrible idea. But He was trying to prove a point, and prove a point he did. Of course, Goodyear was not the only person presenting this miraculous product at the 1851 exhibition. Thomas Hancock was there as well, so you had the Macintosh coats that were available to view. You had things like airbeds and pillows, life jackets, cloaks, and capes. All sorts of variety of things that you would typically think needed to be water resistant or waterproof. Embossing rubber was also very popular, not only in a soft state, which could result in things like rubber slippers, rubber galoshes, and other rubber shoes, and they did predict that eventually rubber would replace leather for shoemaking, which it kind of did. Rubber soles are by far more typical in shoes than leather soles are today. And by the time we reached the late 19th century, rubber was acknowledged as absolutely integral to society and to manufacturing. In 1880, Thomas Bolus delivered a lecture to the Society of Arts on India rubber and Gutta Percha. Summing it up, he said, "At the present time, caoutchouc holds such an important position with regard to the economy of modern arts and manufacturers that were it suddenly to be withdrawn from circulation, many minor industries would in consequence cease to exist, while numerous large and important branches of handicraft would languish until arrangements could be made to adapt their operations to the altered circumstances." So not surprisingly, as we reach the end of the 19th century, there were already many efforts being made to try and figure out a synthetic version of rubber. There were many issues with the process of growing and acquiring natural rubber throughout the world, and this was something that was beginning to be recognized as a large-scale issue for manufacturers and for ethical reasons. The largest exporter of raw rubber in the world in the 19th century was the Congo. Because of the high value and demand of this product, many indigenous men were forced to go out into the forest in order to meet quota. Estimates are that this resulted in as many as 10 million deaths of indigenous people within the Congo Free State. Eventually, the US and other European nations raised enough concern over Belgium's control over the Congo that they changed up the governmental system. Instead of being a state which was controlled by King Leopold, as of 1908, it was considered a colony, which gave power to the government instead of the king. The Congo was certainly not the only region that was growing and harvesting different types of rubber during this era, and it certainly was not the only one that had many of these issues of exploiting local labor and terrible working conditions, but it is considered to be by far the worst example that exists. Issues like this and the general difficulty of the manufacturing process and the acquiring of the natural rubber meant that a substitute was incredibly important. It was just really difficult to find. So many people tried throughout the early 20th century to discover any sort of synthetic rubber that they could possibly come up with. Like I mentioned earlier, Bakelite was able to replace Gutta Percha, but the replacement for rubber, as we tend to think of it, the stretchy, pliable substance, was much more difficult. It came down to DuPont continuously working on trying to find an alternative, and they came up with Duprene in 1931. Now, if you have never heard of Duprene, that's because when it came out, it was still relatively difficult and costly to manufacture, and it never really took off. So after a few years of trying to work with Duprene, they decided to rename it to Neoprene. Neoprene was immensely successful, and demand rose incredibly quickly, especially since they were coming up on World War II. And by the time we reached the US's entry into World War II, they already recognized how essential neoprene was going to be to the war effort. It was something that could be used in gas masks, it could be used in parachutes, and all sorts of other goods that were issued out to soldiers. So neoprene became one of 7 critical materials that the US actually started stockpiling before Pearl Harbor. Interestingly enough, neoprene was the only non-metal of those 7. So not surprisingly, during the wartime, elastic became very difficult to find. Many things in fashion, particularly undergarments, had started using elastic regularly, and now it was not easily found for the general populace. So there were definitely some changes in fashions during that era to accommodate for that, but once the war was over and production returned to normal levels, demand skyrocketed and just kept growing. It was understood to be so essential to not only just fashion, but global manufacturing that DuPont's process was actually part of the 1944 negotiations with the USSR. However, neoprene was never meant to be a replacement for all types of rubber. It did very well in certain circumstances, but it didn't do well in, say, vehicle tires. Neoprene was also still incredibly expensive, and when regular rubber was selling for 18 cents a pound, neoprene was selling for 65 cents a pound. It's a massive difference in terms of manufacturing. However, neoprene continued to be very immensely popular because it could do some things that rubber couldn't. It was much better at being infused into certain surfaces and textiles, and even as of 1970, it continued to be 5% of DuPont's sales. Moving forward to 1959, DuPont had another massive invention called Fiber K. Again, you may not recognize this because when it first came out, no one was terribly interested in it. So they took a step back, rebranded it to be Lycra, and once again, it took off. Lycra is essentially the name brand version of spandex. So there are many other versions of spandex out there, but Lycra is specific to DuPont. By 1961, Lycra was so popular they could not keep up with demand. It was absolutely everywhere. It started off gaining popularity in women's undergarments because it was much easier to clean, care for, and dye than traditional rubber. From there, casual wear was gaining massive traction in the 1960s. And you could find stretch in so many different clothes of this era. Swimsuits and sportswear, dancewear, athletic wear, and even denim started using spandex as of the 1970s. And from there, we just start to see it absolutely everywhere. In fact, today it is honestly more difficult to find clothing without some form of spandex in it than with it. It's estimated that in 2010, out of the 80.5 billion items of clothing that were sold in the US, 80% of them had some form of spandex in them. And this isn't just because the growing popularity of things like athleisure, which is just absolutely booming within the fashion industry, even when fashion itself started to stagnate in terms of its market, athleisure continued to grow rapidly, and the global spandex trade has definitely kept up with this. There are, yes, official reports on the global spandex trade, and we're now at the point where it is a more than $7 billion a year industry globally. That's huge, and it's only expected to continue to grow very, very quickly. This is in no small part because it really is in a lot of clothing. Even clothing that is considered organic can have up to 5% of spandex in it. Of course, with the growing popularity of things like spandex, there is a major issue of environmental impact. Spandex is not environmentally friendly at all. The production of it and the lifespan of it and the fact that it's not really biodegradable means that it has a massive impact on the environment. One of the ways that companies are starting to go about dealing with this environmental impact is through recycling. Now, Lycra, spandex, all of those things can actually be very easily recycled and turned into new product. In fact, as of 2014, Invista, the company that currently owns the Lycra brand, was able to produce a recycled Lycra, which used about 70% recycled goods. So this is definitely a big step forward in terms of managing the impact of the creation, because of course recycling it is far less impactful on the environment, and it of course means that we aren't just tossing away tons and tons of product. So hopefully recycling will be one of the many ways forward, in addition to other techniques in terms of reducing the amount of impact these goods have on the environment. At this point in our society, there just isn't going to be a quick and simple solution to this. While there is definitely a return to natural fibers that is seemingly everywhere at this point, it will never fully replace things like Lycra and spandex and neoprene. These things, along with other synthetic and natural rubbers, are just a regular part of our daily lives, and definitely has a very complex and difficult past and still has a very complex and difficult future to it. The environmental impact that we're dealing with today is going to take a long time to manage, but hopefully over the coming years as this industry continues to rapidly grow. And hopefully more and more time and money of that industry will go towards finding ways to ethically produce and maintain and care for all the variety of products that we have constantly surrounding us every day. So that is a very brief history of rubber and elastic. And like I mentioned, next week I'm actually going to be doing a video on making an elasticated corset from the early 19th century by way of using all of those tiny little springs rather than your traditional rubber elastic like we're used to. No, don't leave! Wait, that's not gonna work like that, you know it. Right, wait. Nope. That was cheating, ma'am! That was cheating! What do you have to say for yourself?